Hello and welcome to NARAL Pro-Choice Washington's 2017 Political Action Workshop. My name is Natalia Cos-Vallejo and I'm the field organizer with NARAL Pro-Choice Washington. Today we're going to take you through some basics of the status of pro-choice bills in Washington state. We'll go over a little bit of history and some basics on how a bill becomes law and what goes on at the state level, and then we'll go into strategies and details about how you can participate in your local government. So a little history on the state of Washington. We do have a lot to be proud of here. In 1970, we passed a referendum by the vote of the people that protects access to abortion care in the state, making it legal and safe. This is 3 years before Roe v. Wade was passed at the national level. So what's really great about that is that we have those protections. Even if Roe v. Wade were to be overturned at the national level, abortion would still continue to be safe and legal here in Washington state. And as if that weren't enough, in 1991, the people of Washington spoke again with Initiative 120, and they further solidified this rule and then also expanded access to lower income folks. So people who are on Medicaid or state-run health insurance can also access abortion care. We also don't have any waiting periods for abortion care in Washington state, which means that a person seeking an abortion can go and get it without too much red tape or time-wasting laws getting in their way. Like I said, abortion access is covered for low-income women, and we also don't have any parental notification laws. Now, we're going to get into parental notification laws a little bit more in detail later on, but suffice to say for right now that just means any law that requires a minor to notify their parents and obtain their consent before they can get an abortion. So we have a lot to be proud of. It's a good state for pro-choice laws at the moment. Now, unfortunately, this will not always be the case, and things are on the precipice of changing if we don't hold our lawmakers accountable. On the left, you will see what most Washingtonians think of our state. We imagine that it's this really blue place, especially if you're from one of the bubble cities like Seattle, but in reality, it's pretty red. Now, these demographics are a little bit misleading because those red counties are really big and have lower populations, but it's still a significant portion of Washington voters that identify as Republicans and tend to vote for anti-choice legislation. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of the basics of how a bill becomes a law. If you're familiar with Schoolhouse Rock, this should be fun for you. First, some vocabulary words. We are going to be talking about session quite a bit. So session is the time during which lawmakers are in Olympia when they're actually doing their job. Lots of folks don't know this, but session is not really all that long. It can really just be a couple months. So the lawmakers are in Olympia doing a lot of work in a very short period of time, and that's why your input is really critical during session. We're also going to talk quite a bit about committees, which are groups of lawmakers who edit bills. And committees are very important because most bills will go to a committee right away before they go to the entire Senate or House floor. So committees make a lot of the really important changes before a bill is even really seen or discussed by the entire chamber. The sponsor is not somebody who pays for a bill, but it is the legislator who brings it to the floor and puts their name on it. We're also going to talk a lot about dummy bills, which are bills that are intentionally created in order to divert attention away from a legitimate bill, to distract, or to confuse lawmakers and the public into thinking that it's doing one thing when in fact it doesn't do anything at all, or actively does the opposite of what it is intended to do. So as of right now, our state Senate is 49 members, and we do have an anti-choice majority of at least one vote in the state Senate. Again, remember that map of Washington that had a lot of red in it? That's represented here. Unfortunately, we do not have a pro-choice majority at the moment, but it's very close. Now, in the State House of Representatives, we have 98 members, and we have a pro-choice majority of about 2 or 3 votes. So that's a little bit better, but again, it's pretty close to 50-50, and I think most Washingtonians would be surprised to know just how close this is. Now, here is the basics of how a bill becomes a law. The expectation is that it should work kind of in a linear fashion, that a bill would first be introduced. It's then immediately referred to a committee. So, for example, if the bill has to do with expanding the light rail, it would be referred to the Transportation Committee. Committees are designed to represent topics, and they're supposed to be staffed by folks who know a lot about that particular issue. And so it's kind of like a small club of legislators who make the first and most important edits, who in theory are supposed to know a lot about that subject. This step is also really important for you because the first committee is when the public is also invited to speak on this issue. So if you care a lot about a bill and you see that it's been introduced, you may want to go down to Olympia and actually testify on that bill. And this is when your lawmakers are really taking the time to listen to you and to hear your stories. They also have some internal discussion and debate, make some changes, make suggestions, and then if they come to a decision, they would then submit it to the Rules Committee, which does more changes and more rules. And then if it gets out of the committee process at all, it would go to the floor for debate. And this is the step where all of the senators or all of the representatives, depending on which house it's in, get a chance to talk about the bill. They'll change it, they'll cut things out, they'll add things, amendments can be added at this stage, and then it goes to a vote. And if it passes, then it goes to the other chamber where the process starts all over again. So if the bill started in the Senate and it gets through the Senate, then it has to go to the House and it starts right at that very first step. If it starts in the House, it would then go to the Senate and do the whole thing over again. This is complicated enough and a very lengthy process. But the fact is, it doesn't even really work this way most of the time. It really looks a little more like this. Any of these steps in the process can be doubled or tripled. The bill can go back and forth and be bounced around. There are also time-bound steps. So every step in this process, or most of the steps in this process, have some kind of cutoff. So, for example, if a bill is stuck in committee for a really long time and they never come to an agreement and submit it to the floor, it could die in committee if it's still there when the committee cutoff date happens. So there's a lot of wiggle room in here. There are a lot of opportunities for lawmakers to add or change things or really change the nature of the bill from what it was originally intended to do. Now, I know this seems probably pretty confusing, but the whole point in sharing this with you is to let you know that there are really a lot of different steps in this process where we can strategically insert ourselves and influence our lawmakers and the general public. It is a very long process, but that means that there are lots of opportunities for us to make changes and make our voices heard. So now that you know how a bill becomes a law, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on this year. We had 4 major pro-choice or pro-family pieces of legislation that NARAL supported and did a lot of community education on. All of these bills, as of right now, are still in process, meaning they haven't died or been shut down. Depending on when you're actually watching this webinar, though, that might have changed. So I'd encourage you to look up these bills and do some research to see where they are in the legislative process. And I will show you a website in a little bit where you can look up that information. The first bill, the Preventative Health Care Covered Without Cost Sharing, is really in response to the Trump administration's threats to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So this bill would guarantee that folks could get birth control without having to pay enormous co-pays in the event that the Affordable Care Act is repealed. As of right now, the Affordable Care Act covers birth control for really anyone who needs it, but if that goes away, will revert to the state of things before it was put in place, which means that a lot of Washingtonians, especially low-income women, would struggle to afford their birth control. So we're really excited that this is continuing on, and we really hope that this bill passes. The next one is 12 months of birth control. This is kind of in a similar vein to the previous one. It means that patients could purchase a whole year's supply of birth control at a time, which would make it a lot easier for people who are in rural communities or who are low income or who have difficulty obtaining transportation. It would make it easier for all of these people to access that important medicine that they need. And it's funny because you really don't see other prescriptions treated with so much scrutiny. If something doesn't have a very short shelf life. Generally, you're able to get as much of it as you need in advance. Birth control really is one of those things where for no apparent reason other than out and out misogyny, it's treated like a controlled substance, and we don't want that in Washington. The third one is paid family leave. This already exists at some levels, but it's expanding. We really want to see new parents be able to take as much time off as they need, especially if there are complications in the pregnancy. And it's pretty self-explanatory. We want more time for families to take care of their newborns. And this would be a statewide initiative, which would actually expand the current family leave laws to extend to 38 weeks. Now, the last one is a favorite of mine. This one would require reasonable pregnancy accommodations for pregnant workers. This is one that we've tried to pass before, and every year the Republicans in the business lobby just shoot it down. And it really is kind of a common sense, logical bill. It just states that pregnant women in the workplace would be able to get extra bathroom breaks if they need them, be able to take time off for their doctor's appointments, that sort of thing, without any kinds of repercussions from their employers. So we think that especially folks who identify as pro-life would be in support of this bill, since it helps ensure healthy outcomes for the mom and the baby. But time and time again, we've seen hypocritical Republican lawmakers who claim to be pro-life and care about families shoot this kind of bill down. We really hope that it goes all the way this year, and it has a good chance of passing. So fingers crossed. Now for our anti-choice legislation, luckily it's a much shorter list, and both of these bills have already died, which is fantastic. The first one, restricting funding for abortion care, would make it so that Medicaid doesn't fund any abortions for low-income women, and it died in committee. And the second one would require parental notification for minors. Now, this is a really personal bill for me. I actually obtained a judicial bypass when I was 17 years old because I wanted to get an abortion and I was a minor at the time. I didn't feel like I could tell my parents, and so I needed to go through the court system in order to circumvent that law and obtain the abortion care that I needed. I can say from personal experience that this is a really difficult process, and it adds further time constraints and monetary constraints on a young woman who's already facing pretty tough odds. So I'm really happy to say that this bill also died, and Washingtonians will continue to not have to do parental notification if they're a minor. So now we're going to talk about how you can look up some of those bills that I just mentioned. It's really important to stay on track with these bills, and it can be a really hard thing to do because there are so many of them. Sometimes one bill will actually have anywhere from 7 to 10 to 15 versions of it. You might see several different drafts come out of the House and several different drafts come out of the Senate that all essentially cover the same topic, but some of them might be dummy bills, like I mentioned before. Some of them might, in spirit, do the right thing, but not be effective or not have manageable timelines. So tracking these bills is really important and admittedly difficult, which is why I recommend using a service like Legiscan. There are other websites like this out there, but Legiscan works really well for me. You'll see in the lower left-hand corner, there's a search box, and you can search for terms. You don't have to speak legalese or be a political scholar. You can type in breastfeeding into that search box, and all the bills that have the word breastfeeding in it will come up. And then you're also able to look at a bill digest, which is just a short, like Cliff's Notes version of the bill. Then in the second pink circle, you'll see that there are some green check marks, a blue question mark, and a red X. You can indicate which bills you are in support of, which ones you're not sure about, and which ones you're against, so that later when you go back, you don't have to reread the whole thing. You already remembered which ones you're looking at positively and which ones you're looking at negatively. Then on the right-hand side, it shows you where that bill is in the lifespan of a bill. It'll tell you where it stands, if it's been voted on, if it's died, that sort of thing. So again, I really recommend this website. It really helps cut through a lot of the confusion when it comes to monitoring these bills. So who are our lawmakers? This may be pretty basic. It might be a refresher for some of you, but I'm going to go over it just the same. A lot of folks are not familiar with the difference between their congressional and legislative districts. So just to recap, we have senators and congresspeople who report to the federal government, and they work in Washington, D.C., and those are the people who are represented by your congressional districts. Actually, our 2 senators represent our entire state, and then our 10 congresspeople are represented by 10 congressional districts. Now, the people who make laws at the state level here in Washington are decided by our legislative districts. Those are the much smaller districts with the red numbers. Each of the 49 legislative districts has 1 state senator and 2 state representatives. And these are the people that I'm really encouraging members to focus on communicating with. Their offices are smaller, they're more localized, and they have more time to really focus on your needs as their constituent. I like to say that, making a call to your state senator is 10 times as effective as making a call to your federal senator. These people really, really have the time and the bandwidth to talk to you, and they want to hear from you. So if you don't know who your representatives are, I'd encourage you to pause this webinar and go to the leg.wa.gov district finder. This is a page on our Washington State Legislature website, and it's pretty easy. You just type in your address and it'll tell you who your representatives are. And then a good thing to do after that is to go back to our website and find that scorecard and see where your representative stands. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we communicate with these lawmakers and what kind of communication tools are most effective. Now, I know a lot of you have probably gone to marches and maybe even made phone calls or written emails in the last few months. We've seen a real uptick in involvement with our lawmakers and the legislative process, which is great. But when you are trying to communicate with your lawmakers, it's important that you use the right strategy for the right effect. So I'll start with the lowest ask, which is social media, petitions, and pledges. These are pretty low-level ways to get involved, and that's not to say that they're a bad way to get involved. It just means it doesn't take a lot of energy or time on your part. Just be wise when you're choosing which pledges or petitions to sign. A lot of online petitions tend to be information mills. There's no nice way to put it. There are organizations out there that are just trying to get your phone number and email address. Make sure that when you sign a pledge or a petition, you know which organization is actually doing the work behind it, and make sure you know where it's going to end up. Chances are, if they don't clearly state, we plan on taking this petition to so-and-so's office by this date, or this is a referendum and we need this many signatures by this date, if there aren't specific outcomes for that petition or pledge, it probably isn't going anywhere. So keep an eye out for that. Social media, sharing things online is also great. It's a great way to share information, but it can be an echo chamber. And so I just encourage you to be careful how you spend your energy in social media. If you're getting into a fight on a thread with your ex-boyfriend's neighbor's uncle, it's probably not a very good use of your time and energy. Lastly, a social media thunderclap. This is kind of a newer technique. There's actually an app called Thunderclap, and how it works is it gets thousands of people to say the same message at the same time. It's kind of like when you're in elementary school and everyone decides to roll their pencils off the desk at 2:15. It really gets a lot of attention for a really brief and synchronized effect. Why this is useful is it can overwhelm the algorithm on websites like Twitter or Facebook and force your issue to the top of people's news feeds. So the second way is postcards, letters, and personal emails. These are a great, very effective way to communicate with your lawmakers. I love sending postcards. It's fast and easy. Emails are obviously free, which is nice. I would just say that when you're sending a letter, make sure that you're using a personal story. This is really important because if you're just recycling the same old message that your lawmaker has seen, it's not going to grab their attention as much. I also love the physical element of a letter or a postcard for this reason, because you actually see lawmakers who will carry those letters around with them. They might use them in stump speeches. It's definitely an emotional tool that lawmakers can use when they're on the campaign trail. If they can pull out a letter from Sally in Walla Walla, it can be really effective. And so they do use those postcards and letters to influence policy, but also to help bring an element of personal story sharing to the work that they do. Make sure that when you're writing a letter or an email that you include an action that you want your representative to take. Make sure it's really clear. Don't just tell your story, but follow it up by saying, and I want you to vote no on this bill. That's really important to give them an actionable item at the end. Form emails are great. NARAL Pro-Choice Washington distributes lots of form emails. It's a really good tool. We write the email for you so that you don't have to spend ages agonizing over the details and researching. That's our job. If you do use form emails, that's wonderful. I would also encourage you to add your own personal story to them. Most websites that do form emails and write them for you are editable. So you can go in, use all the research that we worked hard to put into the email message, and then make it your own. You might also want to change the subject line, since that will make it way more likely that your email will get opened. The staffers in these lawmakers' offices are used to seeing thousands of emails with the same subject line, and at some point they just have to stop opening them because they know that it's going to have the same message. So personalizing it is a really quick and easy way to make it way more effective. Phone calls. Phone calls are also a really great way to communicate with your lawmakers. People tend to get off topic with phone calls, though. You really want to make sure that you're focusing on a topic so that the staffer who's taking your message down can consolidate that message and really communicate what you wanted to talk about to the lawmaker correctly. It can feel good to vent to a staffer about everything that you think is wrong in the world, but they're going to lose track of what you're talking about unless you make it really clear that you're calling about supporting a bill or killing a bill or just supporting a cause in general. If you care a lot about a lot of different issues, make separate phone calls. It's that easy. Make sure also that you're not wasting the office's time. There are two types of phone call, oppositional and supportive. Supportive meaning that you're calling to congratulate your lawmaker or thank them for doing the right thing. This is great, but also understand that these offices have limited staff, and if you're calling and talking to somebody for a really long time, you might actually be impeding them from getting their work done, and your supportive message might be more efficient if you sent it in an email or a postcard. Oppositional take up all their time that you want. If you want to call an anti-choice politician and keep one of their staffers on the line for half an hour, that's fine by me. Lastly, we have come to in-person actions. These are the highest commitment level, the highest ask, and frankly, they're the most effective. Showing up in person really lets your lawmakers know that you care. This can be attending a hearing when the bill is back in the committee stage that we talked about earlier and they're seeking public input. It can mean attending a lobby day that is organized by an organization like NARAL, or lots of other nonprofits have lobby days as well. You can schedule a one-on-one meeting with your lawmaker. Believe it or not, they are supposed to meet with you, their constituents. I would also recommend doing this through an organization like NARAL because we can use our connections to help make sure that you actually get that meeting scheduled. And while it's called a one-on-one meeting, they actually tend to work a little bit better if you get a small group of folks. Your lawmaker is very likely to want to meet with a group of 5 to 10 people. It could be your book club or your feminist huddle club, but scheduling with a small group of your neighbors and friends is a good way to make sure that you actually get that meeting. You can also organize a visibility action at the Capitol, a good old-fashioned rally. That's a great way to get lawmakers' attention. We just held one ourselves on March 8th, our day of action at the state capitol, and we had a lot of attention from the press as well as lawmakers who were walking by and saw our huge numbers of people, and you can believe that it really affected their understanding of our issue and also helped them to realize that the pro-choice folks in Washington are the majority. Lastly, and this is our last slide of the webinar, I want to talk to you briefly about preparing your message to lawmakers, and these tips apply to every single one of the tactics that we discussed earlier. Whether you are writing an email or making a phone call or even sharing something online through social media, you want to keep your message simple, share a personal story, and use priorities messaging. The first two are pretty straightforward. I'm going to talk a little bit about priorities messaging and what that means. So priorities messaging is a way that we communicate with our lawmakers, or I mean, really with anybody. You could use these techniques on your teenage children if you want, and it'll work. It's mind control. Priorities messaging means that you communicate about your values. So instead of talking to a lawmaker and attacking them or saying, "Why did you get a D on the NARAL scorecard? We really need you to step up and you're the worst." It's really more effective if you talk about your shared values and kind of bring them in. It's kind of a mental way of taking their hand and having them walk alongside you. So, an example of priorities messaging might be if I'm talking to my Democratic lawmaker and I say, "Oh gosh, those Republicans, they're obsessed with women's bodies and controlling women's bodies. I really value women's autonomy and ability to get medical care. Don't you value that too?" That's just one example. It's a way of bringing them along on the ride with you and asking them to affirm that they share your priorities and your values. So try to use priorities messaging. Keep your message simple and on one topic. Again, like I said before, if you care about a lot of different issues, as we all do, make separate phone calls or write separate letters. Keeping your message on topic really helps those staffers and your lawmakers keep track of how many folks are worried about how many things. And lastly, just including a personal story can really, really change the tone of your message and give it a much stronger impact. So I would encourage you to use these techniques anytime you're communicating with a lawmaker or with your fellow constituents when you're educating people online. Instead of being combative, ask them to come along on the ride with you and share your values, and tell them a personal story. Give them the reason that you care about our issue. That concludes this political action workshop. Thank you all for joining me. Here are a couple of helpful links that I mentioned earlier. And of course, you can always email me if you have follow-up questions or if you want to get involved further with us here at NARAL Pro-Choice Washington. Thank you so much.